In the bowels of the earth, men clawed through darkness, choking dust, and collapsing tunnels, not for glory, but for survival. Their backs broke under stone, their lungs blackened by poison. This wasn't work. It was punishment disguised as labor. Could you survive a single week? In the early morning haze, long before the bells of the village church rang, groups of men descended into shafts, carved deep into the earth. These were not wide tunnels braced with steel or lit with electric lamps. They were narrow, choking corridors of splintered wood, raw stone, and wet soil, just wide enough for a crouched body to crawl through. The air was heavy, thick with the stench of sulfur, rotting timber, and sweat that never washed away. At best, a miner had a flickering oil lamp tied to his belt. At worst, he worked in darkness, one wrong movement away from a fatal slip. Mining in the Middle Ages was physically and mentally punishing. The deeper the shaft, the more dangerous the conditions. Many mines lacked even basic structural supports. Roofs collapsed without warning. Walls gave way to sudden torrents of underground water. One moment, the ground was stable. The next, it swallowed men whole. The noise was constant. Picks struck stone with rhythmic violence. Carts screeched on crude wooden rails. Voices echoed through narrow passages, shouts, warnings, prayers. There was no silence, only the sound of earth being broken, slowly and painfully. Dust filled every breath. Fine mineral particles clung to the throat and lodged in the lungs. Long before medicine understood pneumoconiosis, medieval miners were already dying from it. Ventilation was nearly non-existent. Tunnels ran long and deep with no natural air circulation. Fires were set at tunnel mouths to draw in oxygen, a method as dangerous as it was primitive. The result was often air poisoned by carbon monoxide or starved of oxygen entirely. There were no warning systems. If a miner passed out, others knew the air had turned against them. But the danger didn't end underground. On the surface, mining towns swelled with displaced peasants and desperate families. Diseases spread rapidly. Water was often contaminated by tailings and runoff. The same rivers used to wash crushed or carried poison downstream. Lead, silver, and mercury were highly sought, but those who extracted them rarely lived long enough to enjoy the profits. Yet medieval mining continued to grow. Across regions like the Harz Mountains, Cornwall, and the Alps, mines fueled royal treasuries and powered feudal economies. Silver from Saxony bankrolled emperors. Iron from Central Europe built armies. Salt, pulled from beneath towns like Hallstatt and Wieliczka, was so valuable it paid entire military campaigns. The wealth went upward. The cost remained buried below, measured in broken bodies, collapsed tunnels, and forgotten names. For every ounce of metal or crystal, there was a man or a boy who dragged it from the earth and paid for it with breath, bone, and time. In medieval Europe, the mine was more than a workplace. For many, it was inheritance. Generations were born, labored, and buried in the same shadow of stone and smoke. There were no apprenticeships in the formal sense. Boys learned the trade from their fathers, not in workshops, but hunched in darkness, breathing dust, scraping or with blistered hands before they were old enough to lift a full pickaxe. Miners came almost entirely from the peasant class. Some were freemen, others bound serfs, but nearly all were poor. In regions like the Erzgebirge in Saxony or Cornwall in England, entire communities formed around silver veins, tin deposits, or salt caverns. These weren't the sprawling mining towns of later centuries. They were dense, harsh settlements, huts clinging to muddy roads, overcrowded and steeped in soot. Work was constant, breaks were rare. Most miners labored 6 days a week, from sunup to sundown, and often deeper into the night if the shafts could be lit. Children were used early, and often, by age 7 or 8, boys were crawling into spaces too narrow for adults, hauling waste rock or managing bellows for primitive ventilation fires. In some towns, orphans or debtors, children were handed over to mine operators. Some were sold, others simply had no way to refuse. They were called trammers or putters, those who pushed or carried. The labor broke their backs before adulthood. Few lived long enough to be called old. Women weren't sent underground, but they worked above it, sorting or boiling water for separation processes, washing crushed stone, tasks done in bitter cold or summer heat. Without pay equal to the labor, entire families were drawn into the system. If the father died in a cave-in or gas pocket, the son replaced him. If the son faltered, the debt was carried by the widow. In areas where mining dominated local economies, miners developed a distinct, though often precarious, social status. Some towns granted limited self-governance to mining communities. Local mining laws, such as the Bergrecht in German-speaking regions, allowed for councils and tribunals composed of miners themselves. Yet these rights rarely translated to security. Mine ownership was typically in the hands of nobility, monasteries, or state officials. The profits ascended, the danger stayed below. Miners' lives were dictated not by seasons or festivals, but by ore yields and cave conditions. They missed births, weddings, even funerals. Their bodies were hardened, but rarely healthy. Their lungs blackened from rock dust. Their joints rotted from damp and strain. The average miner's life expectancy was decades shorter than that of a field laborer. Still, many took quiet pride in the work. It was dangerous, but it was skilled. It demanded endurance, strength, and knowledge passed mouth-chewer through generations. In towns where the mine was the heart of survival, men descended with resignation, but also with identity. They were not soldiers, not craftsmen, not merchants. They were miners. And once you were born into the pit, there were few roads back. Out, medieval miners entered the earth with few protections and fewer tools. There were no mechanized drills, no reinforced supports, no ventilation systems. What they carried was simple: iron hammers, chisels, wooden shovels, and hand-forged picks. Every strike was manual, every advancement measured in inches. In deeper shafts, where ore veins cut through hard stone, fire setting was used, a method that involved building intense fires against rock faces to crack them through heat, then dousing the stone with cold water to create fractures. The process was slow, dangerous, and suffocating. Fire setting filled the mine with smoke and noxious fumes. There was no system to clear the air. Miners either waited for the smoke to dissipate or worked through it, gasping for breath in darkness thick with soot. Lighting came from tallow candles or oil lamps, flickering flames that provided limited visibility and posed constant fire risks in timber-reinforced tunnels. In salt mines, torches could not be used at all, due to the risk of igniting. Trapped gas pockets. In regions where flammable gases were common, deadly explosions occurred with little warning. There were no standardized safety procedures. Timber supports were used sparingly, mostly in larger operations. Smaller or poorer shafts relied on the rock to hold itself. When it didn't, collapses killed without ceremony. loose rocks from above, sudden cave-ins from waterlogged ceilings, and unstable walls brought instant burial. Deaths underground often went unrecorded. If a miner was lost in a collapse, recovery was sometimes impossible. The mine simply moved on. Water posed another constant hazard. Seepage from above or groundwater could fill tunnels rapidly. Some mining sites employed rudimentary drainage systems, buckets on pulleys, or hand-cranked water wheels, but these were ineffective beyond shallow depths. In many operations, miners worked knee-deep or waist-deep in cold water, their limbs swollen and blistered from prolonged exposure. Over time, this led to severe joint damage and infections. Without ventilation, oxygen scarcity was a persistent threat. In deeper shafts, air became thin and stale. Fires used for illumination or ore softening consumed what little oxygen remained. Dangerous gases, often called bad air or choke damp, could accumulate unnoticed. These colorless gases, including carbon monoxide and methane, were silent killers. There was no way to detect them until it was too late. Communication underground was limited to shouting or signal knocking. When an accident occurred, escape was difficult. Many mines had only one exit shaft. If that collapsed or caught fire, those below had no route to safety. Ropes used for hoisting men and or snapped under strain. Ladders, often made of wet wood, rotted or splintered. Falls from vertical shafts caused countless deaths. Still, miners developed workarounds based on experience. They learned how to listen for cracking rock, how to brace walls with timber wedges, and how to test for dangerous air using open flames. These methods were passed down orally, refined not by science, but by survival. There were no guarantees. Each descent into the mine meant confronting the possibility of not returning in this environment. Every tool was both a weapon against the earth and a reminder of its dominance. The mine did not forgive mistakes. It demanded caution, endurance, and often sacrifice. Underground, death often came without warning. It had no form, no sound, no visible threat. The miners called it the foul air, a catch-all phrase for a deadly mix of gases that could extinguish candles, steal breath, and leave men collapsed in silence. In medieval mines, where ventilation was crude or non-existent, air itself became one of the greatest hazards. There were two primary threats: choke damp and fire damp. Choke damp, composed mainly of carbon dioxide, displaced oxygen in poorly ventilated shafts. Miners learned to recognize its presence, not through instruments, none existed, but by observing their flames. If a candle guttered or failed to light at all, they knew the air was turning. Fire damp, primarily methane, was far more volatile. In coal mines especially, it collected in unseen pockets. One open flame could trigger an explosion. There are no surviving records of precise death tolls from these early gas ignitions, but later documentation from the 16th century confirms that such events were already known and feared long before they were formally understood. The methods for detecting and coping with bad air were rudimentary. Miners carried small animals, usually birds or mice, into the depths as crude biological alarms. If the creature collapsed, it meant the air was turning. In deeper shafts, some miners would crawl ahead with a lit candle held low. If it flickered or snuffed out, they backed away quickly, but the margin for error was small. These signs came only seconds before unconsciousness, and there was no known method to revive someone overtaken by the gases. Chronic exposure took its own toll. Lung disease was widespread among medieval miners. though no autopsies were conducted to confirm diagnosis. Written observations from 13th and 14th century physicians described miners who suffered from persistent coughs, bloody sputum, and wasting. Today, these symptoms align with silicosis and pneumoconiosis, diseases caused by inhaling fine mineral dust over prolonged periods. The deeper and dustier the shaft, the shorter the miner's working life. Ventilation systems, where they existed, were crude. In shallow workings, miners relied on natural drafts caused by surface winds. Deeper mines experimented with vertical shafts called air holes, dug specifically to encourage airflow. Some operators used bellows or large fans turned by hand or animal power to circulate air. But these efforts were inconsistent and inefficient. In many sites, smoke from fire setting would linger for hours. Oxygen was consumed by both the flames, and the men working around them. Attempts at improvement came slowly. By the late medieval period, some mining operations in Central Europe, especially in the German-speaking regions of the Harz and Erzgebirge, began, coordinating airflow between entrance and exit shafts to manage ventilation more systematically. But these were exceptions. Most sites remained reliant on trial, error, and luck, no matter how skilled or cautious. Every miner faced the same truth: the air they breathed could betray them. Unlike cave-ins or equipment failures, these dangers offered no sounds of cracking timber or falling stone. They arrived quietly, in the stillness of tunnels carved deep into the earth. The mine's darkness wasn't the only thing that could suffocate. It was the air itself, poisoned, invisible, and utterly indifferent. The deeper the mine, the closer to death. Medieval shafts, often carved through brittle stone or soft earth without reinforcement, were vulnerable to collapse. Wooden beams, sometimes repurposed from shipbuilding, served as makeshift supports. But rot, moisture, and shifting ground frequently rendered them useless. When a beam snapped or a wall cracked, the result could be instant burial. Accounts from mining regions like Goslar in the Holy Roman Empire and Cornwall in England describe the aftermaths of such cave-in. In a 13th century record from the Harz Mountains, an entire crew of silver miners vanished under tons of rock. Their bodies were not recovered. Nearby, work resumed days later. In 1285, a shaft collapse in the Bohemian mining town of Kutna Hora led to a temporary halt in production. Dozens died, but only a few names were recorded, the rest listed as lost. Silence surrounded these incidents, not out of respect, but routine. Death underground was expected. Flooding posed a different threat. Water seeped in from aquifers, burst through walls, or surged downward from heavy rainfall above. Early drainage systems were rudimentary. Miners used leather buckets, hand pumps, or, in rare cases, wooden water wheels powered by animals or small streams to raise water from the shafts. But the technology lagged far behind the risk. In the silver mines of Freiburg, Saxony, multiple drownings were recorded throughout the 14th century, some occurring when miners couldn't flee rising water in time. They suffocated in pitch black, with no exit, the mine consuming them without trace. Falling rock was constant, without helmets or modern tools. Miners often worked crouched or lying down, chipping away at ceilings with picks and hammers. Fractured stone could shear off without warning. Bones shattered, skulls cracked. There were no surgeons in the shafts, only basic first aid, often administered by fellow laborers who had no formal training. If a man couldn't walk, he was hauled out in a basket, if he made it out at all. Medieval chronicles rarely lingered on the individuals lost. Death in the mine was treated much like livestock lost to plague or tools broken in use. In mining towns like Schwarz in Tyrol or Ternowski, Gori in Silesia, local churches sometimes held brief prayers, but few formal funerals were documented. The economic engine of the mine could not pause. A collapsed shaft might be sealed and abandoned. The men would move to a new face of the rock, leaving the buried behind. Rescue attempts were rare and often futile. Without maps, ventilation, or lighting, descending into a collapsed section was close to suicide. In 1321, a collapse in the mines near Annaberg trapped 7 workers. Their cries were heard for a day, then ceased. No one reached them in time. Mining was not heroic labor. It was invisible, brutal, and largely disposable. Each man underground knew the odds. They dug with death above, below, and behind. If they didn't return to the surface, another would take their place before the earth cooled. In the medieval mine, belief filled the gaps left by science, where knowledge of geology, chemistry, and physics failed to explain the dangers of the deep. Superstition thrived. Across Europe, miners carried with them not just tools and lanterns, but a body of folklore that shaped every moment underground. Stories of cursed stones, vengeful spirits, and warnings whispered through generations. The most widely feared figure in German-speaking mining regions was the Bergiest, or mountain spirit, sometimes called the Bergmensch or monk of the mine. In some accounts, it appeared as a tall, shadowy monk figure who punished greed or disrespect within the mine. In others, it was a more neutral guardian, warning miners of cave-ins or gas by knocking on walls. This knocking gave rise to the knocker, legends that would later appear in Cornish mining culture, brought over by German miners in the late medieval period. In Cornwall and Devon, these invisible entities were believed to tap gently on the rock, either guiding miners to rich veins or warning of collapse. Ignoring the signs was considered dangerous. In parts of Bohemia and Saxony, the appearance of certain animals underground, like black cats or snakes, was viewed as an omen of death. Some miners refused to enter a shaft if a bird flew out from it in the morning, interpreting it as a sign that the mine was unquiet. The belief was that mines, having consumed so many lives, retained something of their own will. To disturb them carelessly was to invite disaster. Cursed minerals were another fear. Lead and mercury were associated with disease and madness, even before their toxic properties were scientifically understood. Miners noted that those who worked with quicksilver often became unstable, both mentally and physically, and some attributed this not to poison, but to the idea that the substance was tainted. Silver, too, carried spiritual weight. In Christian law, it was the price of betrayal, 30 coins paid to Judas Iscariot. When silver veins dried up unexpectedly or mines produced less than expected, some blamed divine intervention. Others whispered that the silver itself was cursed. Rituals emerged as forms of protection. In Tyrolean and Slovakian mines, some shafts were blessed by priests before being opened. Candles were lit and prayers offered not just for safety, but to placate unseen forces. In France and Wales, it was common for miners to leave small offerings, coins, bread, or drops of wine at shaft entrances. These gestures were made quietly, sometimes secretly, reflecting a balance between official church teachings and local traditions. Women were often forbidden from entering mines, based on the belief that their presence would anger spirits or bring bad luck. This taboo was deeply rooted in pre-Christian customs, but it lingered well into the Christianized Middle Ages. Yet at the same time, saints became central to underground life. Saint Barbara, invoked against sudden death, became the patron of miners. Her image was painted on shaft walls or carried on medallions. In the Harz and/or mountains, miners celebrated her feast day with processions and masses, asking for protection in a place where death could come without warning. In the absence of scientific understanding, fear and faith intertwined. For those who labored beneath the earth, every tremor, every shadow, every change in air or light held meaning. Superstition was not mere fantasy. It was a survival instinct, a way to find order in a place that offered none. In the heart of Tyrol, beneath the town of Schwarz, one of medieval Europe's richest silver veins reshaped the economic fortunes of the Holy Roman Empire. By the mid-15th century, the Schwarz mines were producing an estimated 85% of Europe's silver, driving the rise of the Fugger banking dynasty and helping finance the expansion of the Habsburgs. But behind the wealth stood thousands of miners, many of them laboring in conditions that bordered on enslavement at its height. The Schwarz complex extended for miles beneath the Alps. The shafts reached depths of over 800 meters, remarkable for the period, with multiple levels connected by vertical passages, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. Air circulation was minimal. Heat, flooding, cave-ins, and toxic fumes from ore smelting were constant threats. Workers often toiled in darkness, guiding themselves by the dim glow of tallow lamps. The deeper the silver ran, the more men it consumed. Mining here was not a free pursuit. While some laborers were technically freemen or wage earners, others were bound by contract, debt, or judicial sentence. In certain cases, convicted criminals were offered commutation of punishment in exchange for years of forced labor underground, a practice documented in Schwarz and mirrored elsewhere across Europe. These men were denied the right to leave, their fates tied to the shafts they helped expand far to the east. The salt mines of Wieleczka, near Krakow in present-day Poland, told a parallel story. Active since the 13th century and producing massive quantities of rock salt, Wieleczka became known as the underground salt cathedral of Poland. The mine contained chapels, stables, and even underground lakes, but these additions came centuries later. In the medieval period, extraction relied heavily on human backs, crude winches, and horse-driven hoists. Miners at Wieleczka worked in shifts that could stretch over 12 hours. The salt dust they inhaled corroded skin and lungs. Eyes stung, joints stiffened. Injuries were frequent, and like in Schwarz, not all labor was voluntary. Records show that serfs owned by the Polish crown or by local magnates were forced into mining duty. Once underground, they had no say in their fate. Some worked for decades without stepping outside the mine complex. The economic power of these mines gave rulers leverage. Silver from Schwarz funded imperial wars and political alliances. Salt from Wieleczka filled royal treasuries, allowing the Jagiellonian dynasty to dominate Eastern Europe. But the more valuable the resource, the more expendable the miner. In both regions, complaints of overwork, injury, and premature death filled administrative records. Burial sites near mining towns swelled with young men lost to exhaustion or accident. Slavery in the mines was rarely called by that name, but the mechanisms were clear. Debt, bondage, forced penal labor, and hereditary obligation chained countless men, and occasionally children, to subterranean labor as wealth accumulated above ground. Generations below risked everything for a king's currency. Salt and silver enriched thrones and fortified empires. But every ounce extracted came with a cost, measured not in coin, but in human years. Mining in the medieval period was not only a gamble with daily survival, it was a slow, certain degradation of the body. Those who entered the shafts young rarely emerged old. The physical consequences of underground labor left visible, permanent marks. Often long before death, malnutrition was a common companion. Wages were low, and food was basic. Bread, porridge, and cabbage dominated diets. Meat was scarce. Few miners could afford the nutrients needed to sustain bodies under constant strain. Calcium deficiency weakened bones. Vitamin deficiencies worsened. Fatigue. In mining settlements, children often began work before adolescence, and their growth was visibly stunted. The act of mining destroyed the body piece by piece. Repetitive swinging of picks and hammers, crawling through tight spaces, and hauling heavy or crippled joints and wore cartilage thin. Chronic arthritis developed in knees, shoulders, elbows, and hips. For many, by their 30s, limbs no longer moved without pain. Miners were recorded limping or stooped permanently forward, their backs bent from years of crouching beneath low ceilings. Lung disease was nearly inevitable. Inhalation of fine mineral dust, especially from coal, silver, or lead extraction damaged respiratory tissue. Without masks or ventilation systems, particles settled deep in the lungs. The result was silicosis or pneumoconiosis, conditions now known as black lung. Coughing fits, breathlessness, and bloody sputum signaled the progression. Many suffocated slowly over years. Lighting deep underground was provided by candles or oil lamps, but smoke often accumulated in enclosed spaces. Combined with darkness and poor air quality, this damaged vision. Miners frequently developed photophobia-sensitivity to light, or went partially blind by middle age. In some cases, eyes were irreparably harmed by prolonged exposure to mineral dust and toxic gases. Wounds were routine. A misstep could lead to a broken limb or crushed hand. Infections were deadly, as antiseptic care was unknown. Tetanus, sepsis, and gangrene often followed untreated injuries. Few medical practitioners served mining towns, and folk remedies, or crude amputations, were the only recourse. Miners operated in environments where even a minor wound could spiral into a fatal condition. The cumulative effect of these injuries and illnesses was premature aging. A man of 40 might resemble one twice his age. Medieval records from mining centers in Germany and Poland consistently describe high mortality. Among laborers before the age of 45, cemeteries near mines contained disproportionate numbers of young adult male skeletons, many showing spinal compression, fused joints, and abnormal rib development. For most, there was no retirement. Those who survived long enough to be incapacitated either begged, relied on family, or died from exposure or hunger. Others perished in the shafts, buried by cavins, or suffocated in toxic air, interred in the very rock they spent their lives breaking. The miner's body, from adolescence to early death, was shaped by the mine, bent, scarred, and worn. It told the unspoken story of an industry that consumed more than it ever paid back. In the shafts, where daylight never reached, faith became a lifeline. For medieval miners, religion wasn't abstract, theology it was, daily survival. The mine was a place of danger and isolation, and belief was one of the few protections available against forces they could neither see nor control. Central to their spiritual world was Saint Barbara. According to Christian tradition, she was martyred in the 3rd century, locked in a tower by her father and later executed. Legend held that as punishment, her father was struck by lightning. Over time, Barbara became the patron saint of those exposed to sudden, violent death: artillerymen, engineers, and most of all, miners. By the 14th century, her name was invoked in mining communities across Europe. From the Harz Mountains of Germany to the salt works of Poland, miners built underground chapels in her honor, sometimes carving them into the very rock they excavated. One of the most striking examples is the Chapel of St. Kinga in the Wieliczka salt mine, over 100 meters below the surface, where miners spent decades sculpting altars, chandeliers, and reliefs from salt. But whether lavish or modest, these chapels were not decoration, they were sanctuaries. Daily routines began with prayer. Before descending, miners often crossed themselves, kissed religious medallions, or paused at small shrines near the shaft. The presence of sacred symbols underground served as both comfort and protection. It was believed that disrespecting the mine, working on holy days, or swearing near religious images could bring misfortune or provoke the wrath of unseen spirits. Rituals were woven into every stage of work. New tunnels were sometimes blessed by priests. In accident-prone mines, processions were held to ask divine protection. Death was so common that many miners prepared for each descent as if it might be their last dot. Faith did not lessen the danger, but it offered meaning amid suffering. In a world where collapse, gas, or flood could come without warning, belief in divine guardianship gave miners something to cling to when wood beams cracked. When the air thinned, or when the walls began to tremble, they dug because they had no other path. Medieval miners, often born into poverty, inherited the trade as one might inherit a surname. It was not a career, but a condition. The shafts were their inheritance, the darkness their legacy. Few entered willingly. Fewer still escaped it. Economic necessity ruled above all. For families tied to mining towns, there was no farmland to till, no guild to join. The mine was the only employer. Payment was inconsistent, sometimes offered in food or housing rather than coin. Yet even this meager return was more reliable than the uncertainty of rural labor or the hazards of the battlefield. The deeper the tunnel, the tighter the grip. In regions like Saxony and Tyrol, sons followed fathers, and grandsons followed sons. The trade passed down not by aspiration, but by obligation. In some areas, men were legally bound to the mine through feudal contracts or urban mining laws, required to serve the operation as long as they were physically able. Freedom, if it came, often came with death. Still, many endured the mines for more than survival. Pride, however faint, existed in their work. They extracted metals that built cities, fueled empires, and filled treasuries. Silver from Schwarz helped bankroll the Habsburg dynasty. Salt from Wieliczka preserved food for armies and markets across Europe. Though their names were forgotten, their labor powered economies and sustained kingdoms. They knew the risks. They knew the air could turn against them, that the ground might collapse beneath their feet. They buried their dead underground. Sometimes in the same tunnels they continued to work. And still, each day, they descended. Today, mining is mechanized, regulated, and ventilated. It is safer, faster, cleaner. Yet, even with these advances, modern workers rarely confront the unlit, unfiltered brutality that shaped their medieval predecessors. No helmets, no oxygen, no guarantees. Their lives were short, their suffering immense, their tools primitive. But they kept going, not for glory, not for fame, not for choice, because to stop digging was to starve. The stone walls of Europe's oldest mines still bear the scars of their hammers. Their echoes remain not just in history, but in the steel we shape, the salt we consume, and the wealth that once rose from underground misery. What they endured remains almost unimaginable. The question lingers in their place: could anyone now survive a single day?